Welcome everyone to the AI Security and Defense Forum. So this is the third session of our fall 2024 series dedicated to the topic of Arctic security. And this session is being co-hosted by myself, Phil, Tinn, and Olivia Houck, with the support from Nurin Das from the MIT Alumni Association. So before we get to the speaker, let me just make a brief announcement on the logistics. We're posting a mailing list sign up link in the chat so that you can receive automatic invitations and related updates about this AISD series moving forward, so that we don't have to spam people for having just registered for a session. So that's the logistics. And now back to the speaker. Today, we're profoundly grateful to have Dr. Abbie Tingstad with us. She's currently a visiting professor of Arctic research at the Center for Arctic Study and Policy at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, and an adjunct physical scientist at the RAND Corporation. Dr. Abbie Tingstad studied mathematics as an undergrad at MIT, environmental geomorphology for master's at Oxford, and then geography for PhD at UCLA. Her research focuses on issues related to strategy and planning in defense and homeland security, and also for the environment. Dr. Tingstad is a prolific researcher and a leading expert on capability assessment of the U.S. armed forces, covering topics that include ISR capability analysis for the U.S. Air Force to ensure, like say, capability to deliver intelligence analysis to meet across settings like conventional warfare or irregular warfare settings. She also covered the applications of, say, AI and machine learning in electronic warfare. It's about the use of machine learning algorithms to enable platforms to learn, reprogram, and adapt to the situation on the fly when there are jamming activities happening in the battlefield. So it turns out that Dr. Tingstad does not only capability assessment, but also solution development, at least at a high level. Dr. Tingstad develops methodologies for foresight activities, such as generating future scenarios for fairly long-term planning exercise that encompass social, economic, geopolitical, environmental, and technological dimensions. And she develops like what we call analytic gaming methods for the U.S. Coast Guard, where players would explore strategic dilemmas that could be faced by the organization in the future. We're talking about 20, 30 years down the road, so that they can make better choices about mission priorities and budget allocation. And she has also testified before the U.S. House Committee of Homeland Security. So last week, Michael Stordahl from NATO STO laid out for us the urgency to develop that scientific and technological edge at the level of the Sputnik moment, as he called it. So today we will take a closer look at some of the more strategic and concrete needs in the Arctic and where technology is expected to make a difference. So please join us. Welcome Dr. Abbie Tingstad to today's webinar. Polar geopolitics is heating up. What's the role of technology? Dr. Tingstad.
Phil, Olivia, and Noreen, thank you so much for inviting me today. I will say it's really great to reconnect with the MIT community. In my Arctic capacity, I will say that I've been able to connect a bit with the institution down the river, if you will, because of their excellent Arctic initiative, but it's also good to reconnect with my own alma mater, of course. So I'm looking forward to seeing where these discussions can lead. I'll just take a brief moment, and again, thank you for inviting me and for the kind introduction, to just also note that the center at which I am now involved at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy is called the Center for Arctic Study and Policy. We have a number of activities that we do, and we divide our time between education, of course, outreach and research. And so there's a lot of opportunities to connect. We are essentially the Coast Guard's Arctic think tank. And we love connecting with other institutions and researchers and others in the community who might be interested in various issues related to both the Arctic and Antarctic. So feel free to connect after this on LinkedIn. We do have an active LinkedIn page. And of course, I am also personally on LinkedIn. So would be really glad to connect with anyone interested in continuing our discussions after this talk. So I always say that any day when I get to speak about the Arctic or the polar regions is a great day. So let's get right into it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. There we go. All right. So I never use pictures unintentionally. So I'll take a quick moment to describe this opening slide here. So the word cloud that you see here at the center of this is actually derived from some research that colleagues and I did that is supported by the U.S. National Science Foundation under their Navigating the New Arctic program. So, and I'll be describing this research a bit further on as well, but as part of our foresight work, if you will, to try to understand what future scenarios of Arctic change might look like, we conducted an activity that is called a Delphi. It's basically a survey that's conducted multiple times with experts from across, in this case, the Arctic region. We kind of ask what the region might look like in the future, and specifically how different parts of the Arctic might look different in the future. And so the word cloud here is developed from some common terms that people were discussing in the course of those multiple surveys. And so what you can see here, interestingly enough, because we're of course interested in tech in terms of this particular group, that technology and infrastructure both, and other words that are associated with technology in some way, shape, or form, such as connectivity or industry, communications, are really, really prominent in the discussion. So even though I think it's maybe common for those that are not that familiar with the polar regions, and maybe the Arctic in this case in particular, to think that the region is kind of a blank slate. There's nothing there, but in fact there are numerous people, and especially Indigenous and First Nations peoples there that have lived for thousands of years. There certainly is a lot of conversation surrounding technology and infrastructure in some places because there is quite a bit of it in the Arctic, and in some places because there is a lack of it, and there is a desire to, in some cases, have some more technology and infrastructure to facilitate communications and things like that. But in any case, just to really emphasize that the Arctic is not a blank slate. There is quite a few issues going on there that we'll touch on some of those today. Now, in terms of the pictures, just to kind of highlight some of the issues that we'll touch upon today, among others, you can see there's a sign for the Arctic Ocean. It was a really big deal when in Canada, there was relatively recently a road built all the way to the Arctic Ocean. For those of you that know the North American Arctic, you know that roads can be few and far between there, as well as in, say, in parts of Russia and elsewhere. So having this road to the Arctic Ocean was a big deal. I just love this photo from Mia Bennett's Cryopolitics, where you see that Arctic Ocean sign very prominently listed there. Another photo that was taken by Mia here right below that is actually from her recent trip to Svalbard. And you can see there too, this is actually from Pyramiden, which is a mostly abandoned at this point site there, but there is active research going on in Svalbard elsewhere, as well as, of course, some coal mining activities. And then there at the bottom of the left-hand side, I put a picture of some sea ice This is actually taken in Finland, so not quite in the Arctic, but in the subarctic, but as a good reminder that mobility across the ice is also an important issue in the Arctic. We often think about how can technology help us access an increasingly, quote, accessible Arctic Ocean, but we also forget that at the same time, climate change is making it harder to access places that we traditionally might have been accessing via sea ice or via ice roads, or frozen rivers and lakes and things like that. So really important to remember that there's different sides of that impact of climate change. Now, on the right-hand side of this slide, I wanted to include some pictures. Search and rescue and emergency response is really important in the Arctic. Technology always plays a role in that, as does infrastructure. And importantly, because the Arctic, and I should say Antarctic too, are very remote locations, and the technology footprint and infrastructure footprint tends not to be as dense as we see in some other parts of the world, that this can be a really challenging environment to operate in. Then we've got some pictures of fish drying in Greenland, as a reminder too that in the Arctic, as in elsewhere, food security is an important issue, and technology infrastructure can facilitate both to improve food security, but also to create problems for it. For example, if there's a massive oil spill in part of the Arctic Ocean, for example, that can really be harmful, of course, to the environment, which includes fish and other sources of food. And then at the very bottom, as one thing that we are being reminded of ever more in the news, of course, is that there is increasing discussion about whether the poles are a contested environment. So this is showing this is a military vessel that is actually transiting through part of northern Norway. Not in any sort of menacing kind of way, but just as a reminder that there is a strong military presence through technology, among other things, in the Arctic region. And in fact, although the Antarctic Treaty does prohibit military activities in the region for the purpose of military activities, but it is often military technologies that help the scientific activities that occur in the Antarctic. So a lot of intersections here for us to talk about. But I'll start by talking a little bit about what we see in the media. And I would argue, and we can certainly discuss this, that polar issues, especially recently in the last several years, have been magnified, certainly, but also in some cases distorted in the media. And what I want to call your attention to here in these example news articles is that there is a invoking of different forms of technology into some rather important geopolitical and strategic and economic issues. So we have here that Canada's new fighter jets are going to be deployed in the Arctic resource war. We've got a very clear picture of a Ukrainian flag here in northern Norway, Kirkenes, near northern Norway. But the article talks a lot about domination of Arctic resources by China and Russia, how naval and air forces may take center stage in the militarized confrontation in the Arctic, for example. We have even more recent article talking about China's Coast Guard entering the Arctic Ocean for the first time. And then I wanted to also include something from the Antarctic as well here, where talking about Russia finding oil, prospecting for oil in Britain's Antarctic territory. So as with typical narratives here, and because we'll be talking about narratives throughout this, I thought I'd bring this up right away. There are always some truths in terms of what is important for these polar regions, but also a lot of things that can get magnified and distorted to play well in the news, or for strategic messaging, or for whatever other reason. I want to be really clear that if you look at the Arctic and Antarctic analytic literature, there's a lot of discussion and analysis about the fact that these are, as we'll be discussing, these are very governed places. There are very, very few active resource disputes, and certainly nothing that would result in a conflict in and of itself, if that makes sense. In fact, in the neither region has a very kind of active dispute over resources. In the In the Arctic, in fact, over the last several years, many of the outstanding resource land claim disputes, maritime disputes did exist, have largely been resolved. There's still one ongoing that the US and Canada are resolving about their border in the Beaufort Sea, for example, but that is taking place, very with a lot of dialogue. There is, of course, a well-publicized continental shelf extension claims through the UN that have been made by Denmark because of the Greenland's geography, Canada and Russia that do overlap near the North Pole, but that is again being taken care of through the United Nations. Furthermore, in the Antarctic case, of course, we have the Antarctic Treaty System where any claims that previously were put forth for Antarctica have been frozen. And so, saying that there is British Antarctic territory is a kind of interesting way of putting it, if you will. That's certainly something that is not an actively explored claim right at the moment. And that the Antarctic Treaty does allow for scientific research. Now, where that science blurs in with commerce or other activities is also something that is really interesting that we can talk about. In any case, I wanted to set up why the title of the talk was about geopolitics heating up. And so here are some of the narratives that we see, among others. As I mentioned, though, despite the perception in the media and in some policy discussions that the polar regions are ungoverned or undergoverned, there are other analysts who might argue that these are some of the most governed spaces in the world, and there's some good reasons for that. In this diagram here, I just wanted to highlight some of the governance mechanisms that do exist in the Arctic and Antarctic, just to make the point that these are governed spaces, and that technology, furthermore, does have an important role in governance, which we'll talk about. So just to highlight a few things that key difference between the Arctic and Antarctic, of course, is that the Arctic includes eight countries, 8 sovereign countries, with their various territories and the various rights that come along with that, whereas the Antarctic is not. There is no country that owns Antarctica, if you will, and that's governed through the Antarctic Treaty System. The Arctic, of course, has a number of indigenous and native communities and tribes. So there are also governance mechanisms that occur, of course, through those groups and communities as well. The Arctic is also known for the governance that's facilitated through the Arctic Council, which doesn't cover things like military security issues or whaling, because in the case of the latter, there's a separate set of agreements for that. And military security was just not included as part of the Arctic Council's charter. But in any case, the Arctic Council has been able to facilitate agreements on things like search and rescue, among other things. Both the Arctic and Arctic, as other parts of the world as well, do have some governance as appropriate through the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So where that applies, obviously delineating where is an exclusive economic zone, how to operate on the high seas, among other things. The International Maritime Organization also negotiated and put into existence a polar code, which governs safety and environmental protection when certain vessels are operating in the polar regions. So lots of different mechanisms here for governance. And as I mentioned, technology is, of course, a key enabler for governance in a number of cases, basically facilitating presence, whether that means physically present with a helicopter or a ship or something like that, but also the presence of understanding what's going on in the region. And that might be through sensors, satellites. That can also be through the coordination between, in the case of the Arctic, indigenous communities making observations, or other local communities making observations, and then working with other organizations to make sure that any hazards or threats are then known to the appropriate authorities. I should also know that technology is also a focus of governance needs. So a lot of, especially what happens in the Antarctic, but also in the Arctic, is focused on science. The science is a major, relatively speaking, if you will, industry, and I'll put that in quotations, but science has been a big focus of human activity in both the Arctic and Antarctic. So governance does also focus on science and the use of technology in science. And I already gave the example of the fact that military activity is not prohibited, is prohibited for military activity's sake in the Antarctic, but it is often the technology of various countries' militaries that is used in order to facilitate the activities which are legally permissible in the Antarctic. I'll also note here that technology is very key for access to resources and mobility, and also how we know about resource activity and mobility. You can see here an example of some night lights picture. This happens to be over the Yamal liquid natural gas project and port in Russia and Siberia. And so technology is a big way in which we access the poles and potential resources there, and also a way that we track what's going on, as I mentioned. So lots of ways in which technology fits in here. But the real crux of the question that we're asking right now about the poles is how durable is polar cooperation? Many of you probably know that in the grand scheme of the last several decades, diplomacy in the Arctic and Antarctic has been, I would argue, relatively strong. When countries have been unable to come to agreement on other issues, they have still been able to come together for certain polar issues. For example, there was a agreement on the protection of polar bears that was negotiated during the height of the Cold War, and that type of cooperation has continued. Most recently, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent joining of the NATO Alliance by Finland and Sweden has, especially in the Arctic, caused some questions about, well, is the Arctic truly exceptional when it comes to cooperation? In other words, is there does the Arctic remain a place of cooperation even when the war in Ukraine is happening or other disagreements are going on in the world? And this is a question that I think is still being answered. I personally, through my research, don't think it's necessarily an on or off switch where it's either exceptional or not exceptional. I think so too for the Antarctic, that the cooperation in these regions, because of the durability that they have seen over the last decades, does remain strong. But in some cases, they haven't necessarily been completely immune over history to conflicts or disagreements taking place elsewhere in the world. What I think many analysts do agree on is that the presence of a conflict in those regions, perhaps with the exception of the not Antarctic particularly, but the Falkland Islands tensions from the 1980s as an example. But conflicts originating in those regions is very unlikely moving into the future. But the idea of having these tensions spill over from elsewhere is a current concern. So just briefly to review some of the concerns that polar stakeholders have. Of course, human safety and the environment is always part of these conversations. Increasingly, overfishing and illegal fishing is coming back to the fore. I'll just remind everyone that there was a fisheries collapse in the Southern Ocean in the 1970s and 80s, and actually part of the Antarctic, one of the Antarctic agreements was motivated by that. That is now increasing concern potentially for the future Central Arctic Ocean, what fisheries may end up being found or establishing in that region. Right now, there's a moratorium on fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean, but right now the different parties to that agreement are in active negotiations about how to conduct exploratory fishing and kind of figure out what the future of that that issue will look like for the region. Many of you are familiar with the questions about access to and control over mobility. There's a lot of press about Arctic shipping routes and whether that's going to be a viable way to shorten the time to get between various Asian ports and European ports, or vice versa. That is an active issue. Russia and Canada, for different legal reasons, claim control over the routes that are close to their shorelines. I mentioned already some issues with questions about the durability of governance mechanisms. Are they enough for the new geopolitical, climatic, and economic situations that we're in today? There are continuing discussions, of course, of who owns various minerals and energy projects and who has stakes in them. But as I mentioned at the beginning, that's not necessarily a question over, especially in the Arctic, over literally which country has control over that. But there are some nuances in terms of which are there threats, for example, if companies that are based outside of that Arctic country decide to invest in that energy or mineral project. Is that a risk or is not a risk? And right now, we're seeing a lot of discussion, especially in the terms of Russia's energy future, about the extent to which China will be able to fund that infrastructure and fund those projects moving forward, which are very important for Russia's economic future. Diplomatic and domestic tensions are always important. And I added, I put domestic here very specifically because I want to acknowledge the fact that it's not just discussions between Arctic countries or Arctic countries and other countries in the world, but also that there are important, especially Indigenous and First Nations groups that are also having conversations with the national governments on various things like energy projects, among others. Two concerns that really relate to technology have to do with rules bending and overreach. So there are differing interpretations, for example, on various articles within the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And so using technology to be able to both kind of demonstrate that rules bending, if you will, as well as monitoring it is important. And the same is true for the potential for illegal use of military capabilities and what we call gray zone activities, which are activities that are not, openly hostile or in conflict, but are still, some form of aggression, and the provenance of those activities is unclear, such as through the cutting of undersea cables, which is an interesting issue because that same effect can be caused either by sort of physical hazards like sea ice, or by, say, a vessel, for whatever reason, dragging an anchor. So a lot of key issues here. All right, so the two areas that my research has recently been looking at that has to do with technology and polar security and stability are the implications of growing divides. And this is especially true and relevant in the Arctic, where you have differences in the technology access and infrastructure that creates part of this, what we call mini Arctics, meaning that if you've been to one place in the Arctic, that could be very, very different than somewhere else that you go. And I'll also note that these differences can sometimes be mirrored to some extent via climate change impacts, which are also variable across the region. My research has also looked at decisions and perceptions about how technology is used. So we have the issue of strategic messaging, which is sometimes enabled by technology, and then also suspicions surrounding the military buildups and what is termed dual use technology, meaning used for science, but could also be used for commerce or military purposes. I'll start with the first. I've recently been working on a project that I mentioned earlier, funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation. And the basic point of that project has been to look at how socioeconomic pressures could shape change in the Arctic between now and 2050. We've explored the many Arctic concepts, including through differing access to technology through that project. And I'll present just a couple of results from our work that looked at these 4 regions that are represented on the map here, which the project, through research and consultation, devised in order to try to compare different regions in the Arctic, recognizing that differences across the Arctic are not just associated with national borders. So the basic premise is, and where technology comes in is, and infrastructure, is that the Arctic is not, you know, a homogeneous zone today. That means, like, why would it be so in the future? So you can see here some night lights data that shows where, you know, you have infrastructure in the Arctic and maybe where there's a little bit less so, and you can definitely see some key differences there. You know, and we want to look at how things like physical presence of sea ice and economic activities could impact the region's future, which of course, economic activities being facilitated in part, at least, by technologies and infrastructure. So just one slide on methodology. Adelphi, as I mentioned earlier, is basically a multi-round survey. This one was actually run in 2021 and just about to be published, actually, in the journal Ambio, the results from that, where we asked experts from across the Arctic region to assess what outcomes might be likely for the different subregions of the Arctic that I presented on the map just a few slides ago. So some interesting findings when we analyze the different discussions which were recorded digitally through that multi-round survey. Here are the 4 regions that we looked at, and we recorded the number of times various terms were used. And interestingly enough, technology was one of the terms that was actually consistently important across the 4 regions, and I should say for different reasons, perhaps. But it was one of the consistencies, in addition to a few others like climate, for example. However, our experts had some differing opinions on the potential for the future of technology expansion in these different subregions. So what you're looking at here is an example of the results. We had 2 rounds where experts were able to basically vote their opinion, where they said technology expansion in this subregion is anywhere from very unlikely, which is the response in these various charts all the way on the left, to almost certain, which is the response all the way on the right. So the blue bars represent round 1, and the orange bars represent round 3. Round 2 is one in which the experts were able to talk to each other virtually to kind of describe why they felt the way they did. And to make the bottom line here is really that in 2 regions, especially the Barents, which includes northern Norway, for example, and the Bering Beaufort, which includes Alaska, and part of Canada and far eastern Russia, there did seem to be a growing consensus among experts that, while not almost certain per se, there could be an expansion of access to technology in these regions, which is interesting because they're really different today. The Barents region today, many would argue, across the Arctic, does generally speaking have a great concentration of infrastructure, and in fact has born some technology companies there, whereas in the Bering Beaufort region, there is relatively less infrastructure, but there may be a growing potential for increasing access to technology. In areas of Nunavut and Greenland, and in Siberia especially, there was a bit more pessimism about the ability to kind of grow access to technology there, though in no area did we see extreme pessimism about the expansion of technology, which I think just lends to the idea of technology being important in the Arctic. Some other analysis that I've been involved with has looked at the way that climate change might impact the so-called, divide of access across the Arctic region. This analysis was taking a look at the impacts of port location and the pattern of climate change impacts for Arctic sea ice. Over the next 30 years or so, Arctic sea ice is going to overall diminish at a more rapid rate, closer to the Alaskan and Russian Arctic. So in terms of increasing the ability to access different parts of the Arctic from ports in in Russia and in Alaska, there will be a greater time savings essentially than from ports elsewhere. And in some cases, that time savings is increasing because there is long-lasting sea ice in near parts of Canada and Greenland. In other cases, for example, in the Barents Sea, by northern Norway, there already is year-round access to those ports, and so there is no gain essentially through melting sea ice, if that makes sense, or no great gain at the very least. But of course, climate change also is creating some uneven access problems. On the left hand here, there's a big impact of climate change on permafrost in some areas, and I really like this among other studies of permafrost impacts on infrastructure and technology, because it demonstrates the fact that there is uneven due to the presence of permafrost and the presence of different soil types. There are uneven sort of risks to different parts of the Arctic region, with the hot spots here, as you can see in red. And then as another example on the right-hand side here, just wanted to highlight again that even though many projections suggest that access will increase over time in the Arctic Ocean, and that can be seen in the green areas there, there's a lot of red on those maps too, and that represents where access and mobility is going to be decreased in the Arctic region, simply due to things like permafrost melt, winter roads going away, frozen access over sea ice, and lakes and rivers will also be going away due to climate change. And so how we use technologies to enable mobility may change pretty drastically in the future. All right, so where does this all leave us in terms of having a bit of a digital divide in the Arctic that might be growing, as well as issues related to, how climate change can exacerbate things like mobility issues across the Arctic. In terms of governance, one concern that we have is that, developing common priorities might become increasingly difficult. One of the bases for Arctic governance and cooperation has been finding these common priorities. If the different subregions of the Arctic continue to go on diverging pathways, if you will, that may become harder. And then fostering additional prospects for consolidating data and knowledge for communication may also face further barriers. We're also seeing kind of a big problem right now due to the increased tensions with Russia of being able to do science in a pan-Arctic way, where we can't, we are not in a situation where data sharing is able to be facilitated in that way. And many scientists are already seeing impacts on their work. Okay, the other topic I wanted to talk about was technology's role in changing narratives about Arctic security. So just a few slides on this, because this is more been a bit of a thought space in my research, something where future research might look at a little more deeply. So technology has long had a central role in these Arctic security narratives. Especially in things like strategic messaging. You can see here a picture on the left that is a Russian scientist and submarine captain from 2007, where a Russian submarine went to the Russian submersible was guided to the North Pole and planted a small Russian flag on the seabed. And so this caused a lot of discussion about Arctic security and Arctic cooperation moving forward. But what's interesting to me is that technology was obviously very central in making that happen and bringing forth that message. More recently than that, there have been a number of accusations towards Russia about interfering with GPS and communications in the high north. And here you can see a map of where there was some disruption in northern Norway. More recently, this was in 2017, but more recently, there's also been some other incidents of that nature where technology has been used to disrupt other technologies. But there is a bit of a message perhaps behind that. And then I also wanted to highlight the recent concerns about undersea infrastructure, where once again, technologies have been used, often something no more advanced than an anchor has been used to either used or inadvertently caused the breakage of data cables and other things. So this particular picture is taken from Svalbard, where the internet was disrupted after a cable was snipped or had broken. But also technology is very important for mobilizing for security situations. I'll just highlight, there's been, from a US perspective, there's been a lot of progress made for the armed services in gaining mobility over land. There was a really important space mission launched through Space Norway in collaboration with the US to provide greater Arctic communications capabilities, both commercial and secure. There's ongoing discussion about how many icebreakers any particular country needs. And in the US, many of you know, it's a very important key issue right now as to what the status of US icebreaking will be in the future. And I did not want to leave out the fact that not all of these technologies for mobilization need to be particularly kind of newly recognized. People have been getting around various parts of Greenland for years and elsewhere in the Arctic using dog sleds. So wanted to definitely highlight that we're not necessarily always talking about the very latest satellite technology as being the most relevant for all areas of the Arctic or all issues in the Arctic. Then finally, dual-use technologies are both an old and new issue. As I mentioned earlier, these are really technologies that can be used for both civilian and military applications. This is a real concern. You know, if a company comes and installs some telecommunications equipment, you know, and then that's able to be used to, say, spy on another country's activities, that is, of course, a huge concern. I would posit, though, as a scientist, that for better or for worse, over history, science has always been dual use, potentially, or multi-use, as I prefer to say. We do science to understand the world. That same science can certainly be used for strategic military planning or commercial, to guide commercial prospecting. So it has always been a problem in quotations, and I don't think that problem is going to go away. So we have to figure out kind of new, novel ways of dealing with that, given the current technological and geopolitical situation that we're in. I have a picture here too of the picture at the bottom left is from McMurdo Station in Antarctica. That's the US research station, but it does have the flags of all 12 original signatories to the Antarctic Treaty, including the Russian flag. So this is one space in which the US, you know, and Russia still kind of coexist, if you will, and at least in theory. But dual-use technology questions are becoming increasingly relevant in Antarctica. And here on the right, I have one of the balloons that Chinese balloons that flew over the US a couple years ago. It's definitely a blurry situation in terms of what's science, what's commerce, and what's military activity. I will share with you just quickly that when I was getting my master's degree, I did install some equipment in a remote part of Wales in the UK, and then ended up having to go collect it from the police station because there had been local concerns about terrorism activities. So I think many scientists, although recognizing the issues that occurred when the Chinese balloons flew over parts of the US in terms of strategic issues, also had a cringy moment where we all kind of thought back to those times when maybe we were a little bit too you know, free for all with our own scientific research and had that misinterpreted as well. So this is an issue that's going to continue and has been here for a long time. So just finally, I think these technological dilemmas will continue at the polls. When it comes to strategic messaging, it's important to remember that we are in an intentional space there. So technology matters. How we use our technology matters. Others are also using technology in a way that might be very intentional. So stepping back and kind of thinking about, from a policy perspective, what that means is important. Not all, in quotations, bad actors may have the same stakes. And they may not be using technology necessarily to, say, in quotations, invade the Arctic or Antarctic, that they may be sending a message about something else that is of particular concern to them elsewhere in the world. And then finally, what to do potentially about dual-use technologies. There is no great answer. We have to maintain awareness of the threats and potential threats. but part and parcel of that is also enhancing capabilities and presence to understand context, which is very important when it comes to how and why technology is being used in these polar regions, where science has always been a very important part of what humans do in those regions. So I'll end just on say thank you again. I have a picture of a polar bear and a penguin here, only because any polar talk has to have those pictures. No technology on this slide. Thank you very much.
Abbie, thank you so much for such a elusive, but then also really compelling presentation. I'm sure all of us have a lot of questions. So I am actually going to start with a question about Svalbard, both because last week we had a few questions up in the chat about Svalbard that we weren't able to get to, but also as a kind of shameless plug for next week's session at 11 a.m. with Alina Baikova, who will be speaking about the origins of Svalbard security from a historical perspective. But the question from actually an anonymous attendee in the chat to you, Abbie, is how do you foresee the future of Svalbard with an increasingly bold Russia and the somewhat strenuous relationship between Norway and Russia? Norway and KSAT have a large base there, as it is an important base for satellite downlink.
If someone would only return my crystal ball, I would be able to answer this question much better. Yeah, so I think Svalbard is one area of the, not just the Arctic, but maybe in the polar policy context in general, that I think we are keeping a closest eye on, because it does have the, I think, the potential to see some tensions rising. I think the fact that there is under the Svalbard, previously Spitsbergen Treaty, because it does allow for economic activities in the region by signatories, all signatories to that treaty, I think that creates the kind of ambiguous space that Russia operates in very well, if that makes sense. So I do think that we are likely to see Russia continuing to kind of poke at the limits of that. I think Norway is in a difficult position, and this is just Abbie's opinion professionally, that I think Norway is in the difficult position of, you know, seeing a treaty that was negotiated in the 1920s, you know, 100 years on, we're in a very different space right now, climatically, economically, strategically, militarily. And I would personally ask the analytic question about what are the limits of that treaty. Are there spaces where some holes need to be plugged or filled in? That will be something that we'll have to see, but very good question.
Excellent, thank you. And just a very quick aside, just because I wrote an entire dissertation chapter on this, the potential for military bases on Svalbard was actually one of the first pieces of evidence that the Soviet Union used to criticize NATO in 1951. So it's been a whole thing, and make sure to come to Alina's presentation. Okay, sorry about that. So another question, and this is from Phil, is how do you, as a trained physical scientist, how did you really get involved in the technology space, and what is the role for physical science within technology policy and within technology research, particularly in the Arctic, but also in general?
Yeah, sure. I think physical scientists are kind of well positioned to obviously use some of these technologies to study what we study. And as I gave in my short kind of story as an aside about, you know, my own little mishaps with my use of technology as a scientist, you know, I think a good group to include in the conversations about responsible technology use for the purposes of science, and where those lines kind of bleed over into commercial activities or military activities as well. Now, in terms of just my own entry point, I think, into the Arctic and technology for the Arctic, I think those who already work in the Arctic space know that it's a relatively small community. And so when we get into that space, we tend to take on various roles and wear different hats. And so we sort of naturally come together and start looking at different spaces, and certainly just given the amount that technology enables science in the Arctic and Antarctic, it was kind of a natural way to slide into the looking at technologies and capabilities as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have something to add here. Just to give a preview to, as a follow-up to this question, and a preview to the audience, on November 14th, we do have a geophysicist colleague from SINTEF, Madeline Lee, who will also present a perspective coming from a geophysicist, domain. So this is something for those who are interested in the connection between physical science and then all the way extended to AI. This is something that we're really trying to connect. There seems to be a big distance in between, maybe not. So November 14th, please come back. But a question from my side is about domain awareness that you have emphasized here and in some other reports on, especially in the capability assessment of US armed forces. So, I mean, coming from the software engineering department at SINTEF, like, we might have a bias to look at this problem through the interoperability perspective, right? Because the environment is so vast. So whatever you get, you can have sensors out there, you can have different parties collecting data, but it's never gonna be, nobody's gonna ever have enough, right? It's so sparse, right? So ideally, we want to stitch these information together in a usable way. So, so can you like give us like a sketch or a speculation on how extensive of a framework or effort it would take, or what sort of cooperation it would be needed for us to get to some level of like interoperable platform where people can do science, people can, or government agencies can make proper forecasting and predictions for planning. So, because it seems like it's just a really hard and sparse space for data generation and collection. And do you know any parties, any efforts on the American side that is also trying to work on the interoperability data cooperation standards?
I would actually argue that I think through the leadership of the scientific community that there actually is the Arctic is and Antarctic, I should add, they're pretty studied spaces, and there are a lot of data sets that are out there, and we also have, for example, some non NGOs and sort of commercial organizations that that also track things like marine traffic and other things. So I think it's not as a scientist, I always have to say this: more data is always great, but I think that we also have done quite a bit of study. I think the key is really, as you mentioned, is really trying to sew things together in meaningful ways, and also recognizing where there are sources of knowledge and information that the academic community has historically, unfortunately, not paid enough attention to. And of course, one of the biggest areas would be traditional or indigenous knowledge, which I think is vastly important. And in fact, there are examples, for instance, in Alaska, where there are different indigenous and local communities that are able to record different observations, whether it be of hazards or accidents, or observations about ecosystems, and they're able to kind of sew some of those insights together. So there are different networks of people doing various data collection efforts, trying to get that into one cohesive kind of place where you can access it. I think is obviously a different story. There are different attempts being made, certainly, and some really good ones. But I think the solution is really going to be making data accessible and knowledge accessible in more formats, so that people can then kind of draw them in and use them in ways that kind of suit what their mission or their needs in particular are. But again, then we kind of get into this question of dual or multi-use, right? Because once the data are out there, they can be used for a number of different purposes. And I think just recognizing that that is the case is important.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, this is the end of our Q&A. We are almost out of time. So I just want to sincerely thank Abbie for such a great discussion. And then Phil, on to you to finish it off.
Yeah, just to, can we look at the schedule for next week and coming the rest of the season? There's slide, let's see, maybe. Yeah, so I think it's coming up. Yeah, so guys, just to give you a preview of the work that will be presented next week by Alina Ikova. She's actually an editor-in-chief at the Arctic Institute. So this is happening next week. And please, if you want to register for automatic updates, go on the website or just go on the LinkedIn to follow us. This is also one other easy way for us to track everybody. So yeah, thank you. And please, yeah, drop us an email where they're published on the website. So if you have any questions, ideas, contributions, or partnership ideas, let us know, and we will see you next week. Bye.